Ready for freedom. In late April 1863, Willie Garrison, the editor's second oldest son, brought home an acquaintance, German immigrant Henry Villard, one of the war's most talented young journalists. Villard had just come from the Sea Islands of South Carolina, where he had observed the war's first emancipated people and the first regiments of black troops. Villard shared with the Garrisons his racist observations of the, quote, half-heathenish blacks in southern coastal South Carolina. As he did so, he condemned the blacks as savage superstitions and described their fetish worship in ways that showed he did not understand their African religions or the ways in which they were remolding Christianity to suit their cultures. Villard derisively called their Gullah language jargon and looked down on them for not comprehending our English. Using the same line of thinking, the Sea Island blacks could have called Villard's language jargon and his religion savage and looked down on him for not comprehending their Gullah or their gods. Nevertheless, Villard's observations confirmed what Garrison had long believed, that nothing else could be expected, indeed, from creatures who had been purposely kept in conditions of brutes, as Villard said. For years, Northern racists had agreed, almost religiously, that enslaved Africans were like brutes. They disagreed, among themselves, about the capacity of black people for freedom, independence, and civilization. This racist Northern debate, segregationists adamant about black brutes' incapacity, assimilationists like Garrison and Villard adamant about black brutes' capacity, became the primary conversation in the wake of emancipation. Hardly anyone in position of authority, whether in the economic elite, the political elite, the cultural elite, or the intellectual elite, brought anti-racist ideas about equal black people into the conversation. During his Boston stay, Villard accompanied the Garrisons about 13 miles south to watch the drilling exercises of the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. In January 1863, Lincoln had asked the Massachusetts governor to organize a black regiment. Men of color, to arms, became the rallying point for black male leaders. By fighting in the army, black men were made to believe that they could earn their rights to citizenship, as if black men had to or could earn their rights. Black male leaders spoke endlessly of soldiers vindicating black manhood, which itself rested on the racist assumption that there was something truly lacking in black manhood that could only be ameliorated by killing or being killed by Confederates. At the same time, some white Unionists posed having to fight shoulder to shoulder with the seething sooty Negro as a threat to their superior manhood, as New York City's Democratic Congressman James Brooks complained. It was a nasty convergence of racist and sexist ideas on the part of both black and white men. By the war's end, almost 200,000 black men had served in the war. They had been killed by the thousands, and had killed thousands of Confederates. So much death as the weak black male stereotype lived on. When Indiana's governor commended black troops for bringing back their equipment when white troops did not, the Indianapolis State Sentinel registered an all-out effort to disparage the white soldiers and elevate the Negro soldiers. White soldiers never reported to black officers. They faced more combat, were rarely enslaved or killed when captured, and were paid more money. Still, the accusation of black favoritism was unending. Racist ideas were easy to revise, especially as the demands of discriminators changed. Democrats changed their racist ideas to properly attack black soldiers. While before the war they had justified slavery by stressing black male physical superiority, during the war they promoted white soldiers and stressed white male physical superiority. While before the war they had justified slavery by deeming blacks naturally docile and well-equipped to take orders, during the war they stressed that blacks were uncontrollable brutes, arguing against the Republicans who had said that naturally docile blacks made great soldiers. Republicans often credited superb black performances on the battlefield to their superb submissiveness and to their excellent white commanders. Both sides used the same language, the same racist ideas at different points to make their case, reinforcing the language and ideas with plausible examples on the battlefield. After the Union's excitement over winning at Gettysburg in early July 1863 and the success of Vicksburg, which divided the Confederacy into two, depressing war news came from South Carolina. On July 18, 1863, almost half of the black 54th Massachusetts Regiment had been killed, captured, or wounded while leading the failed assault on Fort Wagner. The beachhead fortification defended the southern approach to the citadel of the South, Charleston. 600 tired and hungry blacks had spirited in a twilight of bullets and shells toward maddened Confederates and engaged in ferocious hand-to-hand combat. The stories of this battle shot through the North almost as quickly as the Confederacy murdered and captured. The New York Tribune accurately predicted that the battle would be the decisive turning point in the Northern debate over blacks' capacity to fight. As it turned out, the battle was decisive in more ways than one. Catholic publicist Orestes A. Bronson had been one of the many powerful Americans advocating emancipation as a war measure and colonization as a post-war measure, and he advised Lincoln accordingly in 1862. At Fort Wagner, Bronson had to admit that the Negro, having shed his blood in defense of the country, has the right to regard it as his country, and hence deportation or forced colonization is henceforth out of the question. President Lincoln still held out hope for colonization early in 1863. He advanced money to a black minister establishing a settlement in Liberia, which is in Africa, and he complained to an Ohio congressman that he did not know what we should do with these people, Negroes, after peace came. War demands for able-bodied soldiers and the post-war demands for able-bodied and loyal Southern labor and voters had begun to shift public opinion away from colonization. The debacle of Lincoln's administration's colonization schemes sealed the movement's fate. By July 1863, Lincoln was speaking about the failure of colonization. In 1864, Congress froze its appropriations for colonization, and Lincoln abandoned it as a potential post-war policy. The Chicago Tribune confidently declared the end of colonization, but it was not the end of racism. The Lincoln administration's progression of racism meant confining these loyal black voters and laborers to the South, away from the northern and western free white soil. The reconstruction of the Union seemed to be on everyone's mind, including abolitionists. In late January 1864, Garrison challenged an anti-Lincoln resolution at the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society meeting. Garrison's longtime friend, Wendell Phillips, primed to take the helm of the abolitionists from his old friend and mentor, labeled Lincoln a half-converted, honest Western Whig trying to be an abolitionist. As Garrison stared down emancipation, Phillips looked back past emancipation at the Reconstruction of the United States. Back in December of 1863, Lincoln had announced his Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, which offered restoration of rights, except slaveholding, to all Confederates taking the loyalty oath. When loyalty levels reached 10%, states could establish governments that restricted civil rights for black residents, Lincoln had proposed. This was the 10% plan you guys remember from the Reconstruction chapter. But this proposal frees the slaves and ignores the Negro, Phillips snapped. The sizable free biracial community of New Orleans snapped too, demanding voting rights. These biracial activists separated their struggle from that of the Negro, said an observer. In their eyes, they were nearer to the white men. They were more advanced than the slave in all respects. Overtures to Louisiana whites failed, and biracial activists had no choice but to swallow their racist pride and ally with emancipated blacks by the end of 1864. Garrison's principled courage, which had made him a legend when emancipation seemed so far away, had been replaced by practical fear in 1864 when abolition seemed so close. Garrison feared Democrats gobbling up enough war-weary and anti-emancipation voters to seize presidential power, negotiate a war settlement, and maintain slavery. "Let us possess our souls in patience," he wrote. William Lloyd Garrison, the longtime evangelist of immediate emancipation, counseled patience. He was worried in 1864 that Lincoln would lose the election and he wouldn't get emancipation. So he wanted to kind of go calmly. Maryland Unionists went ahead with plans to reconstruct their state without slavery. To encourage them, Lincoln made the short trip to Baltimore and gave one of the most insightful abolitionist speeches of his career on April 18, 1864. He answered the enduring American paradox. How could the land of freedom also be the land of slavery? With some, the word liberty may mean for each man to do as he pleases with himself and the product of his labor, he said, while with the others, the same word, liberty, may mean for some men to do as they please with other men and the product of other men's labor. Lincoln used an analogy for clarification. The shepherd drives the wolf from the sheep's throat, for which the sheep thanks the shepherd as liberator, while the wolf denounces him for the same act as the destroyer of liberty, especially as the sheep was a black one, he said. Hence we behold the process by which thousands are daily passing from under the yoke of bondage, hailed by some as the advance of liberty, and bewailed by others as the destruction of all liberty. Lincoln's freedom analogy, vividly evocative of his self-identity as the great emancipator, rewrote current events. Most enslaved Africans were hardly sheep, waiting on the Union shepherds to come to their plantations and lead them to freedom. The Union lines proved, if anything in this analogy, to be the stable of freedom. While Lincoln emancipated a minority of sheep, most fought off or slipped away from the Confederate wolves on their plantation on their own, and then ran to freedom on their own, and then into the Union Army on their own to put down the Confederate wolves. Since issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln had begun to imagine himself, as Garrison long had, as the liberating shepherd of the black people who were in need of civilizing direction. On November 1st, 1864, Maryland's Emancipation Day, the freed people paraded to the president's house. Lincoln addressed them, urging them to improve yourself, both morally and intellectually, while supporting Maryland's new constitution, which prevented them from improving themselves socioeconomically. Maryland's constitution barred blacks from voting and from attending public schools. The Constitution also sent thousands of black children into long-term indentures to their former masters, against their parents' objections. Lincoln seemed to follow in the footsteps of Thomas Jefferson, pay lip service to the cause of black uplift while supporting the racist policies that ensure the downfall of black people. In setting out the terms of emancipation, Maryland and Louisiana ignored the recommendations of the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission, which had been authorized by the War Department at the request of the Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, radical Republican. In its widely publicized final report in May 1864, the commission called for equal rights, laws allowing blacks to purchase land, and the creation of a temporary Bureau of Emancipation to shepherd free people towards self-reliance. One commissioner, Boston abolitionist James Mackay, advocated redistributing confiscated Confederate land to landless whites and emancipated black people. In promoting equal rights, Mackay and the other two commissioners, Indiana reformer Robert Dale Owen and New England abolitionist Dr. Sam Gidderly Howe, never entertained the idea that blacks and whites were truly equal. They had been charged with answering questions regarding the condition and capacity of blacks for freedom and for free labor, a task whose real aim was assuaging whites who feared the effects of emancipation. Are blacks naturally lazy? Would blacks invade and ruin the North? Could black labor be more profitable in freedom than in slavery? In his AFIC report on runaways in Canada, Howe forecasted that blacks will cooperate powerfully with whites from the North in reorganizing the industry of the South. However, they will dwindle, this social Darwinist made sure to note, and gradually disappear from the peoples of this continent. Commissioner Owen eased fearful Northerners' anxieties by speaking more to the potential contributions of African Americans in AFIC's final report. Their softening influence, drawn from their womanly disposition, will one day improve the hardened national character. The Anglo-Saxon head predominates over the heart, he wrote. The African race is in many respects the reverse of this. A decade after Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, abolitionists still viewed black people through the racist lens. The AFIC reports most of the popular works to appear amid the sudden rush of emancipation literature about the future of black people. Observations noting that slavery had not turned blacks into brutes and had a home in the post-emancipation reports for anyone willing to wade through all of the racist testimonies to reach them. Before supervising the contrabands of Virginia, one Union Army Captain C.B. Wilder admitted, I did not think black people had so much brain. His experience had taught him that they have got as many brains as you and I have, though they have an odd way of showing it. At the end of 1864, 78% of the contrabands under Wilder's supervision were independent of assistance. A superintendent of contrabands, by the way, are slaves that had run away, a superintendent of contrabands in the Mississippi Valley described black intelligence to be, quote, as good as that of men, women, children anywhere of any color who cannot read. William Lloyd Garrison was not among those who questioned the brutishness of former slaves. For 30 years, Garrison had moved Northerners towards abolitionism by sensationalizing the idea that slavery made people into brutes. Like any racist, he dismissed the evidence that undermined his theory and hardened his theory with evidence that supported it. In July 1864, Garrison defended Lincoln's support of laws that restricted the citizenship rights of blacks. According to the laws of development and progress, it is not practicable, Garrison said, to give undeveloped black men the right to vote. Garrison had a difficult time defending Lincoln in the summer of 1864. Democratic editors and politicians were blitzing voters on the dangers of a continued war, emancipated black people invading the North, and Republicans supported miscegenation. War morale had dropped to its lowest level. A Confederate regiment near Washington, D.C., and Union armies were hardly winning battles. The war news got so bad that on August 22, 1864, the Republican National Committee determined that Lincoln could not be reelected. No one had to tell that to Lincoln. I am a beaten man, unless we can have some great victory, Lincoln reportedly said on August 31st. 2 days later, General William T. Sherman sacked Atlanta. Subsequent victories boosted voter support for Republicans, and they consolidated their support by matching the Democrats' anti-black ire. Repulsed, black Americans came together for their first national convention in a decade. They blasted Republicans for remaining largely under the influence of the prevailing contempt for the character and rights of the colored man. In spite of, or maybe because of, black America's rebuke of Republicans, roughly 55% of Unionist Americans voted for Lincoln, and his party claimed 3/4 of the Congress. 45% of the Unionist Americans voted for the Democrats to restore a union with slaveholders. A week after Lincoln's reelection, General Sherman departed captured Atlanta and steered 60,000 Union soldiers in the fabled March to the Sea. Sherman put his total war policies into full effect. The soldiers scorched the Confederate earth. The military installments, communication networks, plantations, everything in their path. 20,000 runaways joined the march to the sea. Reporters telegraphed news of his successful victories through thoroughly pleased Unionist Northerners. By Christmas, Sherman and his tens of thousands of soldiers and runaways had entered Savannah and the hearts of millions. Secretary of War Edwin McMaster Stanton arrived in Savannah after the New Year and urged General Sherman to meet with local blacks over their future. Meeting with 20 leaders, mostly Baptist and Methodist ministers, on January 12, 1865, General Sherman received a crash course on their definitions of slavery and freedom. Slavery meant receiving by irresistible power the work of another man, and not by his consent, said the group's spokesperson, Garrison Fraser. The liberator's name was everywhere. Freedom was placing us where we could reap the fruit of our own labor. To accomplish this, to be truly free, we must have land. When asked whether they desired interracial communities, Fraser shared their preference to live by ourselves. There was a prejudice against us in the South that will take years to get over. Black people all over the South were saying this to Union officers. Do not abolish slavery and leave us landless. Do not force us to work for our former masters and call that freedom. They distinguished between abolishing slavery and freeing people. There was a difference. You can only set us free by providing us all land to till with our own labor, they declared. In offering post-war policy, black people were rewriting what it meant to be free. And, in anti-racist fashion, they were rejecting integration as a race relations strategy that involved blacks showing whites their equal humanity. They were rejecting uplift suasion, like showing how amazing black people are to whites, rejecting the job of working to undo racist ideas of whites by not performing stereotypes. Racist ideas, they were saying, were only in the eyes of the beholder, and the beholders of racist ideas were responsible for their beliefs. A quick pause here. Earlier in this book, the writer talks about this idea of uplift suasion. This was the idea that black people should prove to whites that they're actually good and equal. What this is saying is, look, man, it's not our responsibility to show racists that we're decent. That racism is in the eyes of their beholders. We are good people. They have to figure it out for themselves. Going back to the reading. Savannah blacks did not mention this, but millions of white settlers who had acquired Western land, confiscated from rebel native communities over the years, have been freed. These Savannah blacks, their peers across the South, were only asking for the same from rebel Confederate communities. But racist ideas rationalized the racist policy. White settlers on government-provided land were deemed receivers of American freedom. Black people, receivers of American handouts. Whenever talks earlier in the war touched on distributing land to black people, Americans showed a respect for the landed rights of warring Confederates that they rarely showed for the landed rights of peaceful Native Americans. Since the federal government had started selling confiscated and abandoned southern land to private owners in 1863, more than 90% had gone to northern whites over the widespread protests of local blacks. 4 days after he met with Savannah blacks, General Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15 to rid his camps of runaways and punish Confederates. He opened settlements for black families on 40-acre plots of land in the Sea Islands, and a large slice of the coastal areas of South Carolina and Georgia. By June of 1865, 40,000 people had been settled on plots and had been given old army mules. Sherman's field order was not the first of its kind. Black squatters on the Mississippi land of Jefferson Davis's family had formed their own government and swung a cotton profit of $160,000. Davis Bend became a testament of what Savannah blacks were saying in those days. All black people needed was to be left alone, secure on their own lands, and guarantee their own rights. And yet, for so many racist Americans, it was inconceivable that black people had not been damaged by slavery, that black people could dance into freedom without skipping a beat. General John C. Robinson worried about landowning sluggish blacks preventing the energy and industry of the North from utilizing the valuable acreage. Assimilationists Frederick Douglass and Horace Greeley rebuked Sherman's order, calling for interracial communities and ignoring the desires of local blacks. Greeley wrote in his New York Tribune on January 30, 1865, that Southern blacks, like their fellows at the North, must be aided by contact with white civilization to become good citizens and enlightened men. President Lincoln did not overturn Sherman's field order, nor did he offer his public support or disapproval. At the time, Lincoln was busy expending his political energy on the House of Representatives. It paid off. On January 31, 1865, House members passed the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. The eruption of Republicans on the House floor, all the hugging and dancing and crying and smiling and shouting, foreshadowed emancipation parties and meetings across the United States that night and for nights to come. The 13th Amendment brought comfort to a weary, emancipation-centered activist who was bickering with abolitionists pressing for black civil rights. Days before the amendment's passage, Frederick Douglass and Wendell Phillips had passionately objected to readmitting Louisiana at the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society meeting. To deny blacks in Louisiana voting rights was to brand us with the stigma of inferiority, Douglass intoned. Defending Louisiana's readmission, and Lincoln, William Lloyd Garrison, argued back that suffrage was a conventional right, not to be confused with the natural right to liberty. Political equality was bound to come someday, he explained, but only after black industrial and educational development. Remember to note, William Lloyd Garrison is white, Frederick Douglass is black. On March 3, 1865, Congress established the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, or the Freedmen's Bureau. Heeding the principal recommendation of the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission, so the Freedmen's Bureau, know that. Quite possibly the most difficult duty of the Bureau had been given was to establish racial equality before the law in places where to kill a Negro they do not deem murder, to debauch a Negro women they do not think fornication, to take the property away from a Negro they do not consider robbery, as one Union colonel observed. Another Union general, Oliver Otis Howard, was given charge of the Freedmen's Bureau. The New England native believed that emancipated blacks wished to be dependent on government because they were used to being dependent on their masters. When the Bureau was dissolved in 1869, General Howard bragged that his agency had not been a pauperizing agency since so few had been assisted. Officials of an assisting agency bragging about not assisting people, it only made sense in the context of racist ideas. But the fact that the Bureau did help some people and created some semblance of equal opportunity was too much for segregationists like Dr. Josiah Nott. In an 1866 open letter to Howard, Nott stammered, "All the power of the Freedmen's Bureau or gates of hell cannot prevail against the permanent natural laws that kept black people from creating civilization." On April 3, 1865, Robert E. Lee's army stopped defending Richmond. The next day, President Lincoln walked those same streets. Black people who had freed themselves ran up to him, fell on their knees, kissed his hands, and lifted Lincoln up as their messiah. Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, he's the one that got caned earlier before the war, hoped their outpouring of praise would finally convince Lincoln to support black suffrage voting rights. Black people had loftier goals. All was equal, someone said. All the land belongs to the Yankees now, and they're going to divide it among the colored people. On April 9th, Lee's army surrendered, ending the Civil War. "Slavery is dead," announced the Cincinnati Enquirer. "The Negro is not. There is our misfortune." On April 11th, Lincoln delivered his Reconstruction plans before a sizable crowd in front of the president's house. In defending the readmission of Louisiana, the president recognized that it was unsatisfactory to some that the elective franchise is not given to the colored men. He expressed his preference for bestowing voting rights on the very intelligent blacks and black soldiers. Never before had an American president expressed his preference for even limited black suffrage. "That means nigger citizenship," murmured a 26-year-old actor from a famous family of thespians in Maryland. John Wilkes Booth and his Confederate conspirators had planned to kidnap Lincoln and demand the release of Confederate troops. "Now, by God," Booth reportedly said, staring savagely at Lincoln, "I'll put him through." On April 14th, Marion Abraham Lincoln took in a play, Our American Cousin, from his presidential booth at Ford's Theater. When Lincoln's bodyguard stepped away sometime after 10 p.m., Booth crept up behind Lincoln and shot a bullet into Lincoln's skull. It was Good Friday, 1865, and Lincoln passed the next morning as the crucified great emancipator. "Lincoln died for us," remarked a black South Carolinian. "Christ died for we, and me believe him to be the same man's." With emancipation assured, William Lloyd Garrison retired 3 weeks after Lincoln's death. "My vocation as an abolitionist, thank God, has ended," he said. Other abolitionists refused to retire with him. American Anti-Slavery Society members refused Garrison's request to dissolve, gave his presidential chair to Wendell Phillips, and remade their slogan, "No Reconstruction without Negro suffrage." AASS members had high expectations for Lincoln's replacement, a Tennessee Democrat born into poverty who had once signaled to blacks, "I will indeed be your Moses," and who had once stammered to planters, "Tall poppies must be struck down."